one of our board members. So I'm glad you're here, Mary. We were approached by History Colorado, the executive director of History Colorado, the statewide preservation organization, to do some work around women's suffrage in Colorado. And the bottom line is there's been so much written word, wonderful scholarship around this subject. And what had not been really called out when we were contacted about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, were the historical sites and those tangible places that we as preservationists can go to and know that history was made in those sites. And this whole project was really put together and sparked by, of course, as you all know, in August, we celebrated 100 years of women's suffrage. And so when we were asked to do this call, we contacted Erika, who I've worked with for years and who is an amazing scholar, to start digging up those sites in Colorado history. And so with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Erika. Who is working to get herself unmuted. This Zoom thing.
Okay.
All right.
There we go. I am balancing 2 different screens so that I can look at the slideshow and not be looking at all of your faces, which actually it's actually nice to be able to see you all, but I just want to be able to concentrate on the slideshow, at least for the moment. I just want to thank Cindy and Beth both for having, so I should say thanks to Beth first for having Cindy and I here today with you all to present this project that we've been working on. And also just a big thanks to Cindy and the Colorado Historical Foundation for really, this was the first project they kind of gave me out the gates as I started my own consulting firm. So what a wonderful project to start off with. So excited to have been part of that. So I have a lot of history to get through, a lot of slides. So as Cindy already mentioned, this project was funded by a grant from the History Colorado State Historical Fund, and Colorado Historical Foundation hired my firm, Clerestory Preservation, to complete the work. So as Cindy already mentioned, there's already scholarly articles, courses, etc., talking about this very complex history of women's suffrage. And I can't possibly try to recreate that for you. And of course, there's a national history as well as local histories. This project is focused just on Colorado history and trying to tie those historic sites to the history. So a few things I did want to note, as has already been mentioned, this is a complex history. There's a lot of intersection with other historical movements like temperance, early feminism, the progressive era, etc. There's also not a clear start date, although the suffrage movement kind of started to mythologize itself, if you will, by saying that the Seneca Fall Women's Rights Convention in 1848 was the date that women's suffrage started, which isn't quite accurate. I also want to emphasize that the term equal suffrage is not quite accurate in the sense that there's an incompleteness to that equality, both during the women's suffrage movement up through 1920, but honestly, that continues today. So for example, American Indian women and men weren't even considered US citizens until 1924. Chinese American women were not guaranteed the vote until 1943. And the Voting Rights Act was intended to prohibit discriminatory polling practices, etc. So I keep that in mind as we use the term equal, that we're really just talking about the women who had the wherewithal and means to fight for themselves to gain the vote during this movement. I also want to point out that this term suffragette is actually a derogatory term that was coined in 1908 in England. So I always use the term suffragist to just acknowledge that these are the people who were supporting suffrage for women and not using that diminutive term. One other thing to note is that it's easy to use the phrase that women were given the vote, but I, when at all possible, tried to use the terms that they won, that they gained, that they fought for suffrage, because it certainly wasn't going to just happen if it wasn't for their efforts to make it happen. So in my research of women's suffrage in Colorado, there emerged from that 5 distinct eras that range quite widely in their time period. There's the territorial period from the 1860s to 1876, the state constitutional convention when Colorado was trying to get its statehood, and that early effort to include suffrage, women's suffrage with that statehood constitution. Then kind of a reorganization of the movement when that first referendum failed. Then the second referendum in 1893 when Colorado women actually did win the vote by popular vote. And then following that 1 year, the span from 1894 to 1920, when Colorado women continued to be involved in the movement and the state was held up as an example for the nation. So as I talk through these eras, I will also, when possible, be mentioning a few sites that came up during my research that were identifiable as having clear association with the movement. At the end of talking about these eras, I will also then talk about the property types, the kind of trends of places that fall into certain categories that seem to help exemplify the suffrage movement through its 60-year span in the state. So beginning with the territorial period, women's suffrage, of course, was started at least as early as 1848, much earlier, coming out of the abolitionist movement. But heightened interest in women's suffrage really followed upon the Reconstruction constitutional amendments that came after the Civil War, specifically the 14th Amendment of 1868, which among other things spells out who is a citizen, meaning a person born or naturalized in the US. And it restricted states from curbing the privileges and immunities of citizens. And then the 15th Amendment of 1870, which prohibited states from denying a citizen the right to vote based on their race, color, or previous condition of servitude, obviously meant to address the newly freed slaves after the Civil War. During the ratification of this amendment, that caused a huge split in the national women's suffrage movement between those who supported the 15th as a step in the right direction of equal suffrage for all, and others who were bitterly disappointed that women's suffrage was not included in the 15th. They had fought very hard to include the term sex or gender in what was prohibited as a basis for denying a citizen's right to vote, but they failed in that, and this difference of opinion split the national movement for several years. So there were as the Western territories really started to develop after the Civil War or during the Civil War, 2 immediately provided women's suffrage in their formation, Wyoming in 1869 and Utah in 1870. And this likely arose out of a complicated mix of partisan politics and a desire to attract more people, especially women, to these new territories. Colorado became a territory in 1861, so before Wyoming and Utah, but didn't include women's suffrage in its territorial laws at the beginning. However, Colorado's first territorial governor, John Evans, supported women's suffrage and encouraged the territorial legislature to consider it. And they certainly debated a bill for women's suffrage, like it may have happened at the Loveland Block in Golden, when Golden was the territorial capital from 1863 to 1869. That effort failed and didn't go anywhere. Then following on the heels of Wyoming and Utah's passage of women's suffrage in 1870, the Colorado legislature took up the topic again, and many women suffragists were attending those proceedings. And newspapers at the time expressed very vocal opinions that they were concerned that these small groups of women were having an undue influence on the legislators. Ultimately, that effort was rejected as well. Following upon these kind of early moves towards women's suffrage, national women's suffrage leaders made a tour of the Western states in 1871. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to Colorado on that tour. And we know the towns which they spoke in, but so far have not been able to identify the actual places in which they spoke. Around the same time, there was a test of this idea of the 14th Amendment, a legal theory that was proposed by Virginia Minor of Missouri and her husband, who was an attorney, that the 14th Amendment automatically provided for a women's right to vote since women were citizens, as defined by that amendment. It didn't define any gender, it just said persons born in or naturalized in the US. So there was leaflets published that encouraged women to test this theory by attempting to vote, particularly in the 1872 presidential election. You may have heard of Susan B. Anthony famously being arrested for trying to vote. That was part of this effort. She was fined, ultimately fined for that illegal activity, but never paid the fine. In Colorado, Albina Washburn, a suffragist in northern Colorado who helped settle Big Thompson and then Loveland, did the same. We haven't been able to identify where she might have voted, that those likely happened in a kind of makeshift tent or other place that no longer exists. And we also aren't quite sure where any attempts to find where she's lived during her lifetime. She was a very active suffragist, hasn't borne fruit yet of any existing places. It's possible that other women in Colorado attempted the same, but I haven't found any reference to that possibility. There were definitely specific communities in the state that were particularly active in the suffrage movement, notably Denver and Greeley. The Meeker family of Greeley were very active in the suffrage movement, and this is their family home from circa 1885, which still exists and is now listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Father Nathan Meeker, the wife, I can't remember her name, forgive me, but their daughter Rosine as well were all very active. Rosine circulated a suffrage petition to the territorial legislature trying to get them to take up the issue again. So after the territorial period and these kind of almost half-hearted attempts by the territorial legislature to even consider it, it picks up again when the state decides to make its third bid for statehood. They were unsuccessful the first two times. So they have delegates coming to Denver to help create the state constitution that they'll submit to the US Congress in hopes that it's approved and they are made a state. At the same time, suffragists organize and hold the first suffrage convention in Colorado at Unity Temple in Denver, which has been long since demolished. Dr. Alida Avery, who was a physician at Vassar College for several years before she relocated to Denver in 1874, was elected president of the new Suffrage Association. There's also two delegates of the Constitutional Convention who supported suffrage. They were also on the Suffrage and Elections Committee. Agapito Vigil, who was a rancher in Los Animas and Huerfano counties, originally from New Mexico and a native Spanish speaker. And then Henry Bromwell, a lawyer from Denver, who was originally from Illinois. Together, the two authored a minority report on why women's suffrage should be included in the Constitution. which was then debated by the General Convention itself. The Constitutional Convention also received many petitions and letters from across the state, what was to be the state, and the US, advocating for them to include women's suffrage in the Constitution. Ultimately, that was rejected for fear that if they included it in their bid for statehood, it would be rejected and they would lose the opportunity to become a state. However, they did kind of provide a few piecemeal offerings, if you will. One, they allowed for women to vote in school-related ballots, such as school board elections. Certainly one oppositional theory against women's suffrage was that women belonged in the home. School-related issues were considered still within the domestic sphere and therefore probably appropriate for women to have a say in. However, the Constitution did also provide for a future possibility to include women's suffrage if it was approved by the general electorate. So it actually directed the first General Assembly of the state to hold a popular vote on the issue. So before the state has even been fully approved by the US Congress, the campaign for that popular vote has begun in the state, and suffragists begin to organize, and they begin to write newspaper columns on a regular basis and editorials, letters, etc. Ultimately, Colorado became a state in August 1876 and immediately took up the issue of passing a bill to refer the subject of women's suffrage to the general electorate. They considered 4 different bills, but ultimately passed one that was supported by the Colorado Women's Suffrage Association, so that voters could vote on it in the first state election of October 1877. At the same time, a second suffrage convention was held in Denver at the Lawrence Street Methodist Church, which we have a photo of, but unfortunately that was also demolished. In preparation for that vote in October of 1877, again, national suffrage leaders came to the state to take on a speaking campaign to promote the idea of why women's suffrage was a public good. So Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and Henry Blackwell toured the state along with local suffragists like Mary Shields of Colorado Springs. Anthony spoke in towns such as Pueblo, Walsenburg, Trinidad, Del Norte, Lake City, Saguache, Granite, Leadville, Canyon City, and Fairplay. Stone and Blackwell also spoke in Georgetown, Empire, Silver Plume, Idaho Springs, and Greeley. And then Mary Shields spoke extensively in the southern counties where most of the population at the time spoke Spanish due to their kind of immigration from New Mexico and the former Mexican territories. Her speeches were so popular that she was often asked to repeat them so they could be translated. So though we know many of the towns that these suffragists spoke in for this 1877 referendum, it's been difficult to pinpoint the exact locations of many, either because they weren't specifically referenced in newspaper accounts or that they've been since lost or have long gone. One notable exception is the Hinsdale County Courthouse in Lake City, where Susan B. Anthony spoke on the front steps to such a large crowd that the building couldn't accommodate them, so she was forced to do it outside. Unfortunately, there was an overwhelming defeat of women's suffrage in the 1877 election, with only Boulder County passing a referendum, and the overall margin of defeat was 2-1. The newspapers at the time were generally against, thought that this was really outsiders trying to influence Colorado voters. And there was also a question from both suffragists and those who opposed women's suffrage, whether women actually even wanted the vote. So following this first defeat, there was kind of a reorganization of the suffrage movement in Colorado. This period has sometimes been called the doldrums of the movement, which isn't quite a fair assessment, but certainly was a time for reorganization. The original Colorado Women's Suffrage Association was dismantled, and much of the structure of the movement was left alone. There were occasional speeches and attempts to reorganize, including visits from Eastern suffragists and Albina Washburn putting out an ad in the newspaper asking those who were interested in suffrage to correspond with her. Ultimately, in 1890, national suffragist Matilda Hyman comes through Golden and then later Denver. Her ostensible motive is to raise money for South Dakota's statehood bid and the need to include women's suffrage in that statehood constitutional bid. However, so while she's in Denver, she helps reform the Colorado Women's Association, and it becomes an auxiliary of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. At the same time, this is a time when a lot of new people are coming to the new state, including suffragists from the East. One notable example of this is Elizabeth Piper Ensley, a Black woman from Boston who was on the faculty of Howard University before moving to Denver with her husband, who was a former slave, and their children in about 1888. She would be a founding member of the new Suffrage Association and its treasurer. It's important to note here that Black women were certainly involved in the suffrage movement. They, of course, had a lot to gain from winning the vote, but unfortunately, there not only some kind of underlying racism within the national movement, but they aren't identified as such.
Did we lose
I think we
Erika?
might have. I think we might have. Let's just give her a second because I'm sure she's frantically trying to get back on.
I'm sure you're
Yes, we-
right.
Oh, but that's her. Erika,
Hello, I
Hi.
apologize for that.
it happens. It's out of your control, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, I am trying to blaze through this, so let's try again. Nope, excuse me for a second. Okay. So, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you for confirming. All right, I think I've pretty much nailed that on the head, that last slide. I'll just move on to this next one. Another important aspect of this reorganizational period was Caroline Churchill moved to the state and started the Queen Bee, which was a newspaper intended to address women's issues. It was first known as the Colorado Antelope.
Erika, if I may interject, your
Yes.
share screen has dropped. So we're seeing your lovely face.
Okay, let's try this again.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, okay. Oh, I have so much to get through that I'm just, so there's the Queen Bee newspaper, which helps raise the issue and makes it a more popular subject, as well as women decide they really need to start taking advantage of the ability to vote in school board elections to demonstrate that they do want to have political agency and participate in elections. Another important aspect of this period is that in 1892, that election, the People's Party, also known as the Populist Party, won numerous seats in the state's General Assembly, as well as the governor's office. Though women's suffrage was not a plank in their platform, it was implied with its equal rights for all stance. So after that 1892 election, several suffrage bills were introduced in the General Assembly. One in particular was supported by the State Suffrage Association. That was written by Denver attorney J. Warner Mills and sponsored by Representative J.T. Heath of Montrose, who was a populist. Suffragists attended the General Assembly proceedings to observe. Ultimately, it was successful, and Davis Waite, the governor, signed the bill, essentially forwarding it to the electorate to vote on the issue in the 1893 election. This only left the Suffrage Association a few months, though, to organize and campaign. They almost immediately renamed themselves to the Nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association, the idea being to de-emphasize women and emphasize equal. Ellis Meredith, a journalist with the Rocky Mountain News, sometimes referred to as the Susan B. Anthony of Colorado, and Iona Hanna, two leading suffragists, visited an assembly of national suffrage leaders in Chicago during the World Fair of 1893 and tried to make the case that Colorado was now ready to successfully include women's suffrage, and they wanted the national leaders to participate. They were pretty skeptical and actually rather bitter about their previous experience in 1877 and wanted to decline to participate, and thought that simultaneous efforts to have women's suffrage in Kansas and New York might be better served. However, they did send Carrie Lane Chapman, who is later known as Carrie Chapman Catt, as the national representative to help with the campaign. This is a photo from 1895, so after the referendum, but Ellis Meredith is circled on the left, and Mary C.C. Bradford of Colorado Springs, another prominent suffragist, is on the right. So Minnie J. Reynolds, another journalist for the News, was chairman of press work for the Suffrage Association and managed to convince 75% of the state's newspapers to support the effort by granting space for pro-suffrage columns and editorials. The Suffrage Association was given headquarters space in the Tabor Opera House in Denver at the behest of Horace Tabor's second wife, Elizabeth, who you most likely know as Baby Doe. And then by November 1893, 60 chapters and over 10,000 members of the Suffrage Association were established across the state in communities such as Parachute, Una Vista, Pueblo, Manitou Springs, Mancos, and Villa Grove. Chapman Catt made an extensive tour across the state in several communities, which I'll talk about a little bit further down the line. One important impact or factor in the 1893's referendum is the silver panic, which was a financial downturn associated with the devaluation of silver, and it led to a severe economic depression and backlash from the state's workers, particularly miners and farmers. So suffragists tied their fight to that economic recovery, arguing that women should be allowed to vote since they were also affected by unemployment and poverty. Suffragists also used this opportunity to advocate to working men at poverty relief places like the People's Tabernacle in Denver. And overall, the silver panic of 1893 definitely caused many voters to question the status quo and kind of opened the door to the possibility of new issues like women's suffrage. As opposed to the 1877 campaign, there were also a lot of coalitions developed during this time. So the Suffrage Association was really trying to tie their argument for why women should have the vote to a lot of other movements and issues, such as the temperance movement. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union had just a few years prior started to openly support suffrage, seeing that as a way to gain their goals. Several temperance union chapters across the state also became involved in the suffrage movement. There's also the Grange, which was a essentially farmers, workers movement. They, from their establishment, had always welcomed men and women as equal members, and therefore were also very supportive of equal suffrage. At the same time, women's clubs were gaining in popularity, and though most across the nation were preferred domestic or cultural topics for their club meetings, Colorado's actually happened to be very politically aware and were very involved in the suffrage movement. All in all, opponents of the suffrage movement didn't appear to be very well organized and didn't really do anything to try to sway the public's opinion about it. They seemed to think that it would likely go down just as it did in 1877. So ultimately, the referendum solid majority. Colorado became the first state where women won the vote by popular vote. It wasn't the actual first state to have women with the right to vote, since Wyoming had gained statehood in 1890 and had continued to include women's suffrage in their constitution. So once they were granted or won the right to vote, women immediately registered, and that was a common reporting topic in newspapers around the state of which women had started to register to vote in their communities. They also organized themselves to educate themselves on the workings of government and provided classes to each other. A newspaper called The Women Voter was created by the Suffrage Association and published many articles on workings of government, political issues, how to vote, etc. 3 women also ran for a state office in 1894. Carrie Clyde Hawley of Pueblo and Clara Cressingham and Frances Clock of Denver. They won their seats, and they were some of the first legislators to actually work in the state capitol building, which opened for the General Assembly in January of 1895. Hawley in particular immediately took up several issues that concerned women, passing a bill that raised the age of consent. After this time, small numbers of women fairly regularly were elected to the House of the General Assembly through the 19-teens. Helen Ring Robinson was the first woman elected as a state senator in 1912. And then Agnes Riddle, who was a former House representative, was elected senator in 1916. But after her election, there were no more female state senators until 1940. But women were also elected to other state and local political offices, such as Regent of CU and the State Superintendent of Education. Women legislators were able to successfully champion a number of causes like an industrial school for girls, the abolishment of capital punishment, compulsory education for all children aged 8 to 14, and the creation of kindergartens and county high schools. However, they still faced derision and dismissal in the General Assembly, and many issues that they wanted to see through were unsuccessful. And this left some suffragists feeling a little disillusioned about the whole movement itself and the success of gaining the vote. But following upon the referendum, Colorado did become an example for the nation. And slowly, but essentially surely, Western states especially started to include women's suffrage in their state constitutions, which is very dramatically illustrated by this illustration from 1915, kind of showing the golden light of the Western states and their enlightenment to the struggling women of the East. So the National Women's Association, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, by this time was led by its second generation. Susan B. Anthony had passed by this time, as well as a few other well-known leaders. They became focused on a state-by-state effort, really trying to just chip away state by state, trying to get them to pass women's suffrage. But what would become known as the National Women's Party was led by a third generation, a younger generation led by Alice Paul, and their focus was on a national amendment that would just in one fell swoop provide votes for women across the country. Ultimately, most scholars, I think, would agree that it's these simultaneous efforts, even though they might have been seen as working against each other. It was those twofold approach that really led to the success of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Colorado women remained very much involved in the movement, particularly Ellis Meredith and Elizabeth Ensley, who I talked about earlier. The National Women's Party, the kind of more radical arm of the suffrage movement, which was formerly known as the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, established a state headquarters in Colorado Springs. Alice Paul was very much influenced by her time in England and the suffrage movement there, which was very interested and centered on public display. And this is where you start to see the public protests, the parades, the pageants that you've likely seen many historic photographs of. Those didn't really happen in Colorado because we had already gained the vote before that became a popular strategy. But it was one that was certainly favored by the National Women's Party and Alice Paul. Some of them included things like a suffrage special or the Flying Squadron, which was a train tour of the United States that made stops across the country advocating for women's suffrage. And they made stops in Colorado Springs since the headquarters for the National Women's Party was there. Many young women from Colorado left the state to participate in these protests, including Natalie Gray, who's she was from Colorado Springs and one of the silent sentinels who stood outside the White House, silently protesting Woodrow Wilson's opposition to women's suffrage. Another example is Bertha Arnold, also of Colorado Springs, who was arrested in 1919 for what were called the Watchfire protests, where they were trying to pressure the US Congress to pass the 19th Amendment. Both of these women were from Colorado Springs and daughters of suffragists from that city. And both were arrested and ultimately were speakers on what was known as the prison special tour of February and March of 1919, where they toured the country and talked about the inhumane conditions they suffered in prison just for protesting their right to vote. Ultimately, the US Congress passed the 19th Amendment in June of 1919, and then in order for it to become successful, 36 states had to ratify it. Wisconsin and Michigan were the first of those, and then finally in August of 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state, and the amendment was adopted as part of the US Constitution on August 26th. Colorado ratified the amendment in December of 1919, and here is a picture of Governor Oliver Shoup signing the state's ratification with a number of suffragists and women representatives looking on. And then beyond the 19th, in 1923, Alice Paul and her cohorts organized a 75th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. They held a pageant at Seneca Falls, which was so successful that they repeated it in Colorado at the Garden of the Gods. It was billed by the Colorado Springs Chamber of Commerce as a major event, and 20,000 people were reported to have attended. You'll note the orchestra in the pit there of the largest photo, and then participants who dressed up in historical costumes to commemorate the first generation of suffragists. This anniversary pageant was also a means to kick off the next goal of the women's movement, which was Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, as that continues to have a bit of a saga today, which I won't get into at the moment, but of course that has not been adapted into the US Constitution yet. So just checking my time. I will just very briefly, so that hopefully we have time for maybe a few questions, we'll talk about the property types that I identified as part of this research and trying to summarize the history and context of the women's suffrage movement in Colorado. Trying to represent the greatest degree of geographic diversity as possible, ultimately sites that were identified as being extant and having a direct association with the movement were found in 12 of the state's 64 counties, but I think pretty well represent a good regional aspect of the state, from the northern section to Front Range cities to mountain towns and the San Luis Valley. So homes and/or workplaces of suffragists were certainly considered to be the most common sense and likely property type associated with the suffrage movement. As part of my work, I created a database of over 400 suffragists who were mentioned in historic accounts of the movement in Colorado. Many of these, their participation in the movement spanned decades. Following that, dozens of those suffragists were researched in an attempt to find places associated with them. Certainly all of those that have been mentioned thus far in this presentation, as well as places, those who lived in places like Breckenridge, Longmont, Grand Junction, Leadville, Durango, Rifle, and not to mention the major cities along the Front Range. The biggest challenge that I found was that the bigger cities, of course, many of the places I was able to find, say, an address for a suffragist, those have been demolished due to development pressures and just the changing city. Those still extant tend to be from later periods. One probably big exception is the Meeker House in Greeley, which I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The challenge for smaller communities is that it's actually harder to find exact addresses associated with suffragists because sources like censuses and city directories, it was a small enough town that they just kind of mentioned them by name and maybe provided a street, but not much more than that. So the scope of this project didn't allow me to kind of dive deeper to find those, but it might be possible with further in-depth research. But a few notable exceptions to this trend are the Lucy McIntyre House in Fort Collins. Lucy McIntyre was an ardent suffragist and member of Women's Club and president of the local temperance union chapter, and she held many meetings about temperance and suffrage in her home from the 1880s through 1920. Ellis Meredith, who I have talked about before in this presentation, she was a prominent leader of the movement from the circa 1880s up through 1920. She was personally known to the movement's leaders in the East and held political positions in Denver after gaining the vote, and continued to support the national movement and continued to travel and correspond with national leaders. This home that we see here is where she lived from circa 1900 to 1918. Then we have the J. Warner Mills house. As mentioned before, Mills was the attorney who authored the suffrage bill that became the 1893 referendum. And in 1893, this is where he lived in Denver. His offices from this time, which might be more naturally associated with his work, are no longer extant. He did live in Lake City during the time that Susan B. Anthony spoke at the Hinsdale County Courthouse, and it's reported that he attended that speech, and that's what kind of prompted him to become involved in the suffragist movement. Elizabeth Ensley, of course, as mentioned before, was a founding member of the State Suffrage Association and its first treasurer. She went on to found the Colored Women's Republican Club and the Women's League of Denver to encourage Black women to vote. This was her home from circa 1915 to 1917, and it's the only known location that we know was associated with her that still exists today. Another property type is suffrage organization meeting sites. These can overlap heavily with the homes and workplaces of suffragists. Some of those, like the Denver headquarters at the Tabor House, have been long demolished. But a few found examples. One that's promising is the 8th Street Baptist Church in Pueblo. It's known that this African-American congregation and its women worked for the 1893 referendum and were big proponents of the suffrage movement. Further research needs to be done to kind of verify the details of that, but that's particularly promising. Unfortunately, the headquarters for the National Women's Party in Colorado Springs has been heavily altered, such that I'm not even entirely sure it's the same building, into a restaurant that you can kind of see the difference here between the earlier period and today. Another example is coalition or advocacy sites, where essentially those organizations who weren't directly involved with suffrage but supported it met and had activities that where they were supporting suffrage. The Bartholf Opera House in Loveland was where the Grange met, the local Grange chapter met regularly, and where they presented, where they presented a Farmers Institute during the 1893 campaign, and speakers at that institute included suffragist Albina Washburn. Other examples, like the People's Tabernacle, where poverty relief programs were being held and women were advocating for women's suffrage to the people they served there, have been demolished. But there's definitely further opportunity for research. Another example is the public speaking sites of both the 1877 campaign and the 1893. It was certainly unusual during this time for women to speak in public. It was a bold act for them, but that was the preferred method for their persuading the American public that women's suffrage was a public good. These are some of the easiest sites to track down, since, of course, by design, they sought to spread the word of suffrage widely, and were fairly well advertised in newspapers and etc. They also represent probably the greatest geographical reach besides the homes and workplaces of suffragists. So here we see a few examples of places where Carrie Chapman Catt and others spoke during the 1893 campaign, and where Susan B. Anthony spoke during the 1877 campaign. Another is political action sites. This is a little bit nebulous, but I thought it was important to include kind of almost like a catch-all category for places that maybe weren't sites of protest, since we didn't have those so much, but where attempts to garner public awareness or acts that challenge the status quo of women not participating in political life were taken on. So this would include places like where the 1891 and 1892 school board elections were held, where the 1894 first wave of female legislators campaigned for themselves, as well as places where women organized to educate themselves about the political process after winning the vote. These have been fairly difficult to track down thus far, but one example is the Garden of the Gods for that later 1923 event. And then, of course, there's government sites, which are fairly limited, but where government acted upon the issue of equal suffrage during the 5 eras of the movement. The state capitol building is the most prominent. Of course, that's where the first women legislators went to work, but is also where the 19th Amendment was ratified by the legislator and signed by the governor. The Loveland Block in Bolden, which I previously referenced, still exists, but it's been remodeled and altered many times over since the 1860s. And then finally, we have legacy sites. This was actually beyond the scope of this project, but it focuses on the women's suffrage movement. It doesn't have direct association with the women's suffrage movement, but it warrants a mention here because it's certainly a further avenue of research to look at the continued work and life of the women who were involved in the movement. One example is the Denver Women's Press Club, which was purchased in 1924 by the club at the behest of Minnie J. Reynolds, who was, as mentioned before, a prominent suffragist and really worked to get it in the press. And then finally, I'll just mention that we hope there will be future phases to this project, including those avenues of research that I mentioned in passing, looking at maybe smaller communities to see if the places of the suffragists that lived there can be found, and any further references to like public speaking sites, etc. And that concludes my presentation. I hope that wasn't too rushed, but I'm happy to answer any questions that there might be.
Great, that was great. Thank you, Erika. Really appreciate that. That was very interesting. Who's got a question? I know I do.
Why don't you kick it off, Beth? And then it looks like
great.
there's some that came in through chat, which I'll try to read after you go.
Great. I have always hoped that because Elizabeth Ensley was the treasurer of the Equal Suffrage Association Coalition of Colorado, that lent credence to the idea that Colorado just did it in a more inclusive manner than was done nationally. Am I right?
I'm sorry, Beth, would you repeat the first part of the question? So what makes you think that the Colorado movement was more inclusive? What?
The fact that Elizabeth Ensley was the treasurer, a
Yeah.
respected and trusted position.
Right. I mean, there were definitely, Ida B. Wells in Chicago was another prominent suffragist. So I don't think Colorado is unique in that way. I think as opposed to, say, the southern states whose suffragists were vehemently opposed to Black women being involved in the movement and protested their participating in national pageants, I think there was quite a bit of inclusivity in other regions of the country, but they might still have kind of been pushed to the side, or maybe not as included as elsewhere or in other realms of life. But so I don't think Colorado is unique, but I think the Western aspect might have helped with that to a degree. It's hard to say. There's certainly some racism going on, and actually proponents of women's suffrage in the Western Territory, some of them wanted to give women the vote to dilute the vote that Black men gained by the 15th Amendment. So, and that was a reason why that some, say, Wyoming legislators supported women's suffrage in that state. So there's certainly racism throughout the period and nation.
There's some, oh, go ahead. You're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
Hey, Erika, you seem to know about this, and it's a thing I'm confused about. Maybe you can confirm or deny. My understanding was always that Susan B. Anthony was the one who spoke in Lake City, and that Stone and Blackwell were touring the more northern part of the state. Were Stone and Blackwell in Lake City with Anthony?
I don't believe so. I don't recall seeing reference to that. However, they did overlap. Sometimes Anthony would come through and then Stone and Blackwell would be close behind and present again. So I can't definitively say that they did not speak in Lake City, but my understanding is that it was Anthony who was the one who spoke there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's some interesting questions coming in over chat, not questions as much as, this is the part I love, the kind of the crowdsourcing element of this. For one, somebody asked, is your database public? And this absolutely, I mean, we want this information out there. We want people to use it and research it. Our hope is to ultimately get it on the website of the foundation so that we can use it and then integrate it with the State Historical Society's database. I'm not sure how that's going to work yet because they're sort of working on that. But there's some interesting comments here. PH Pasco says, Helen Ring Robinson spoke all over the country in support of women's suffrage. She lived in several places in Denver, Pennsylvania, 1441 Pennsylvania and 1441 Josephine, as indicated in city directories. Erika, you're shaking your head. What do you know about this one?
So I, and I'm sorry that I can't bring it to the forefront of my mind immediately. I do know that one of the properties that she's known to have lived at, it might be the one on Pennsylvania or Josephine, is also no longer extant. So she was, there are so many suffragists with the potential to research and find, but unfortunately, she wasn't one that I focused on quite as much as others.
I believe Pat wrote a biography of.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely right, which I referenced and was wonderful.
I just think she should get credit for her traveling all over the world, really. She went to Europe representing the United States and spoke on suffrage. And then she wrote a book on how to be a good voter for women.
Yes, so thank you for that. I've already made note of many things that I'd like to add into the report that I've ostensibly finished. And certainly that would be one that kind of expanding on her role in the suffrage movement.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
You know, as with every project, this was the seed project, and we really hope to continue it. And I want to thank Beth and the League of Women Voters for supporting this and writing support letters. We actually do have a pending application into the National Park Service to do further research on this. This is kind of like a seed project. Of course, sadly, all these things take, Erika doesn't work for free. As lovely as she is, I wish I could engage her every day. We do want to take all of these things to the next level. And so I would like to, does anybody, I see some more questions. Lulu Lincoln and Eudora Logan were the first two Black women in Pueblo.
Yeah. Yes, so I actually have noted that in the database, and Lulu Lincoln in particular, she was a school teacher. I tried to track her down in Pueblo. I think someone else asked about what sources I was looking at, and definitely city directories, censuses, newspaper accounts. History Colorado has a whole slew of organizational papers from the Suffrage Association. All of that I did my best to look at. The pandemic kind of hit right as I was trying to get going, so that was certainly a challenge. But there's, and I should also give credit to, there were a lot in commemoration of the centennial of the 1920 19th Amendment being ratified. Many local communities were undertaking ways to celebrate their role and their suffragists, including the Women's Suffrage Centennial of Southern Colorado. Their website has been a great resource for me, and definitely should be looked at by others. Fort Collins took on many efforts to identify some of their places, which is how I came upon the Lucy McIntyre House. So I'm standing on the shoulders of many people by presenting this to you, but this is, many people have been involved in this effort in many different ways. And the report I wrote does its best to try to make sure that they get credit for all their work that they've done.
And it's definitely a huge topic, to be sure. And I would like to just put out my email address out there if anybody has anything to add, because there's definitely a crowdsourcing opportunity here. And the more we can bring to this, and more we can understand kind of these tangible sites to be able to tell the story. But my email is very easy. It's Cindy, C-I-N-D-Y, at CO for Colorado, Historical Foundation.org. So it's Cindy at COHF.org. And as I said, this is, you know, just because the anniversary, the centennial has come and gone, doesn't mean that this is going to go away. This is a huge topic we really want to continue to work on. And what's so fascinating about it is as Erika speaks so eloquently to, it's not isolated. There's social issues, there's ethical issues, there's so much to this issue that we would like to expand on. And so, you know, you can't just isolate it out there in its own little field. And so anything you guys can share with us or think about, I'm so accessible that I would really love to hear what everybody thinks on this.
Any other last questions here?
Looks like
Okay.
Wendy has a question. Or
Wendy, would you
know?
Wendy
Right.
is my mom, so I have to answer her question. You're on mute, Mom, but maybe you don't need it. Okay.
She says,
we'll talk.
all right, I'll say what you were
afterwards.
going to say, which is Erika is wonderful. That's what you were going to say.
I didn't have a question. I don't know how that came up, but hi, Erika.
Hi.
Cute. So nice. Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you, to Erika and Cindy. We really appreciate this presentation, and we hope you'll follow up as you learn more. This is personally interesting to me. I worked at the State Historical Society from 1990 to 1996, and it has a dear place in my heart. So I feel like I've come full circle here. But thank you so much. Thanks to all of you who have attended, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Beth. Thank you for hosting us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.